Hello, everybody, and welcome to another season of ArsenalPass Limited Time Only. What you can expect this season is a video series on the ArsenalPass channel. I will be focusing on heavy hitters draft, although you can probably use most of the information for sealed as well. So who am I? I'm your host. I'm Juha Saarnilampi, hosting this season instead of Hayden Dale. You can find me on Twitter at Bramblespark. I'm a fab dad, 30-something from Finland. And my fab achievements, you can see some of them here. So many of you might know me from my Pro Tour Baltimore top 4, but also some people might know me from Twitter, where I post a lot of like speculation about future sets and cards and so on, as well as other fab content. In this first episode, we will be talking about, first of all, the grading system that will be used throughout the series, but then I'll also go into some generic tips about heavy hitters as a draft format. For example, booster configuration, defensive values, hero game plans, common play patterns, etc. And toward the end, I will be grading the generic cards that you can draft. So let's look at the grading system first. I will be using a familiar grading system from ArsenalPass, where we have grades from A through to F, and then some cards also get special mention as a sideboard grade. So what are these? The A's, these are the absolute bombs. So if you think about the previous two sets that we've drafted, Bright Lights and Monarch, think of cards like Demolition Protocol or V of the Vanguard. Also in previous sets, you can think of some of the chest equipment. They tend to be A's, some of the tunic type effects where, for example, the Draconic one in Uprising, where you get a resource if you've played a red card this turn. Super strong. So those are the bombs. Those are the ones you often sort of pack one, pick one, especially if they're for more than one hero. Then you have the Bs. These are the really strong core of your deck. You would like your deck to be mostly Bs, but of course that's impossible. These are cards like Overloop Red or Dread Screamer Red from the previous two sets. So very core to the game plan of your hero and usually, on rate at least as well. Then we have the Cs. These are the role players, the standard core of what your deck ends up being more often than not, even though you would like it to be A's and B's. These are cards like Razzle Dazzle Red from Bright Lights or Engulfing Light Red from Monarch. So this is sort of where the edge of playability starts to creep in, where you would really like to play the C pluses more often than not. And more often than not, you would like to avoid playing the C minuses. C is kind of a good place to be of thinking, this is roughly where I'd like my sort of playables to end and to have a 30 or 40 card deck or whatever you have in that format. And then we go into the Ds and the Fs. So the Ds are still playable. They're cards that generate value more than a cracked bauble, but they are cards that you would normally not want to put in your deck. These are cards like Infuse Alloy Yellow in Bright Lights or Blood Tribute in Monarch. And then you have the Fs. LSS has gotten pretty good at printing very, very few Fs for limited anymore. Talisman of Dowsing is a good example of a card like that, where it's close enough to a cracked bauble that it doesn't even deserve a D. And finally, we have sideboard grades. So some cards like Overload Script or Blinding Beam, they can get sideboard grades where you might not put them in your deck against, for example, 2 of the 3 heroes or 3 of the 4 heroes in the set, but you would really love it against, Tekla Vossen, for example, when it comes to Overload Script, or Levia when it comes to Blinding Beam for Prism. I will differentiate between pack one, pick one grades, as well as hero-specific grades. So something is a pack one, pick one, B. It can be, for a specific hero, it can be an A, or it could even be a C, right? That depends on the flexibility, right? The flexibility of the card is what takes it from the hero-specific grades to the pack one, pick one grade, because of course early on you would like to stay open in this format as well. All right, let's jump into heavy hitters and what it is as a draft format. So first of all, if you look at the booster configuration, this is very, very important for these limited sets because it tells you a lot of information about what has been taken from the pack. It tells you a lot of information on how can you signal to the person on your left. And overall, it just gives you an idea of what you can find in the packs and how much you can find them during the course of the draft. In heavy hitters, we're looking at, first of all, when you open a Belgian print pack, you're going to open 5 class commons, and they're always 2-2-1, meaning that there will be 2 of one class, 2 of another class, and 1 of the third class. Never, ever any other configuration, as far as I've heard. So what does this mean? It means that if you know that the person to your left is very strong and adept at reading signals, which they more likely are on, let's say, the calling or especially the Pro Tour level, and more often are maybe not on the RTN or the ProQuest level, then, but if you know that that's the case, if you know that the person to your left knows how to read signals, and you see a pack where there's only one of, let's say, a brute common, you can very strongly signal brute to your left. Because when they count the cards, they notice that the brute common is missing deterministically. This is not the case in all formats, but it's the case here. It was the case in Uprising, where you could really strongly signal a class by taking the sole lonely class common. And that was in that format, which was, I wouldn't say about forcing, but it was about picking your lane pretty early. In that format, having that kind of information available to you, that the person to your left probably knows what you're drafting, was very, very valuable. I'm not yet sure if it's that valuable here. All right, so after the 5 class commons, what you'll get is 3 hybrid commons. I think 2/3 of the time, as far as I know, they come in 1-1-1, meaning there's 1 for each class pair. And 1/3 of the time, one of the class pairs is missing and there's an extra of one of the others. There should never be 3 of a single class pair. It should always be 1-1-1 or 2-1-0. Here, the signaling is much trickier, so I wouldn't use this for signaling that much. Of course, what you could do, sort of, if you want to math it out, you could say that, let's say from this pack, which has a Guardian Warrior, Vigorous Windup, it has a Brute Warrior Lead with Speed, and then it has a Brute Guardian Wage Might. If, let's say, the Lead with Speed was taken from this pack, which is a very reasonable first pick, you get the other 2 hybrids, and there's a hybrid common missing, that 2/3 of the time it's a Brute/Warrior card. But what does that exactly tell you? Not that much. So don't get too deep into this, because they can, of course, swap on the next pick or whatever. So it's not as strong of a signal nearly as if, let's say, the lone warrior card, let's say Draw Swords, was missing from the top row. Then that's a much stronger signal that the person to your right is probably trying to tell you that you should stay away from warrior. All right, after the hybrid commons, you will get 3 generics and equipment, and they always come in 2 of one and 1 of the other. So it's either 2 equipment, 1 generic, or 2 generic, 1 equipment. That's it. And finally, the pack will be finished with a rare, which also has the rare weapons and the rare equipment in the first slot. Then you have a rare plus slot, which can have Majestics as well. And then there's a foil, rainbow foil, which can be anything except the reprints, which is kind of funny, where, if we start going to sets which have even more reprints than this one, and the reprints don't come in foil, then that's going to skew some of the numbers, but not something to really worry about here. I think there is an effect where there are so many Brute reprints that Brute might have like 2 fewer commons per box than the other classes, or something like that. But it's such a tiny effect that you should not worry about it. All right, what's special about this set that you notice very early on after coming from Bright Lights is the defensive value. So if we look at the commons, 2/3 of the commons, or 66%, block for 2. And since you're looking at 11 commons and sort of 2-ish rares per pack, or maybe it's more often actually 12 commons and 2 rares, then you are staring at a deck which mostly sort of at least 50%-ish blocks for 2 on average. And that's a significant number compared to Pride Lights, where most of the cards block for 3. 33% of the commons block for 3 then, and 1% or basically Test of Strength blocks for 4. For rares, it's kind of the other way around. 20%, only 20% block for 2. These are cards like Wage Gold and Stacked in Your Favor. And 73% block for 3. And finally 7% block for 4. So this is all the Test of Mights and Agilities and Vigors and Reinforce the Line as well. If you look at the classes, what's interesting is that they're almost mirror images of each other. Each class's commons have 4 sets of block 3s and 2 sets of block 2s for Warrior and Guardian and block 0s for Brute. And then each class also has that one blue alcohol-themed card which blocks for 2. And then if you go to the rares, if you look at the classes, all the 3 sets of rares that the other classes get block for 3, but Guardian gets 1 set which blocks for 2, which is Stacked in Your Favor. So if you look at the totality, Brute probably blocks the worst in a sense that it has 0 blocks or no blocks basically in Bare Fangs and Wild Ride. But Guardian is pretty close behind because it has the same amount of block 2s in commons as Warrior, but then it also has a block 2 in rares. So Guardian is not the Guardian of old here. It's actually blocking a little bit worse than Warrior is, especially when you take into account the fact that a lot of the Warrior cards and the Warrior weapons, they care about blocking with attack actions. And the only class that can reliably block without spending attack actions is Warrior. So Guardian is actually significantly worse at blocking than Warrior if you factor that in. Still, we'll get to it, but it doesn't mean that suddenly it flips the table around and Warrior is a control deck and Guardian is an aggro deck. That's not the case. I think what fixes that is the number of these heroes, a number of these classes that are drafted per pod, where there will sort of, my estimation is that most pods will have on average more Brutes and Warriors than Guardians. And if you're looking at 1 to 2 Guardians per pod, suddenly you can get a lot more 3 blocks than the folks who have 3 or maybe even 4 Brutes or Warriors who are fighting for these 3 blocks. So sort of keep that in mind when thinking about these block values. Finally, we have equipment. A lot of equipment in the set. We have 24 draftable equipment in the set. Some of them at rare and some of them at common. An optimized suit of equipment will block roughly 4 to 8, you could say. It depends a little bit on which ones you scored, which ones you got. You can kind of go up to 8 in the setup you have here, where you have, let's say, a Knucklehead as your headpiece, a Raw Meat as your chest piece, and then Gauntlet of Might and Flat Trackers. So that's 3 plus 3 plus 1 plus 1, but that's a little bit theoretical because you would more often than not activate the Gauntlet of Might and activate especially the Flat Trackers for its ability, also to turn on the Raw Meat. So you're not actually blocking for 8 with your equipment. Where you could be sort of blocking for 8 in some cases is if you start bringing these adversity equipment in. So there's a set of adversity equipment where they're Blade Break 2s, but you can only block with them if the opponent has done X, which is basically destroyed one of the 3 core tokens, Agility, Might, or Vigor, or then drawn a card if it's the headpiece. So these Blade Break 2s can sometimes make your total equipment set sort of actually block for 8 in some cases, but it's more often that you're blocking for sort of 4 or 5, but then also getting some useful abilities out of the hybrid equipment. But it's something to keep in mind, and drafting equipment here is actually quite important. Not only because it blocks much better than in previous sets. So you have these Temper 2 equipment, which are, in basically every previous set, it would have been like a completely crazy bomb. So not only do you have those, but you also have equipment that combos with some of those. So like the Gauntlet of Might and Flat Trackers, they combo very well with the raw meat because you can sort of decide when you make those tokens and when that raw meat and similar cards stand ground and beckon applause when they are online. So not only do you have really good defensive values, you also have good combos of equipment. So they become quite high picks. Next, let's look at the hero game plans in heavy hitters. So we have 6 heroes. And just as a general note, I'm sort of expecting that all the people watching this, all the people listening, they are mostly familiar with the set and the basics of what the heroes do, etc. So I will not be going, very deeply into explaining the absolute basics. I'm expecting you're more of an intermediate drafter who wants to get better, who wants to get to the expert level. So that's kind of the level we're going for here. So let's look at the hero game plans in the set. If we look at them through these 2 axes that I've sort of invented for this purpose, we have the aggressive or defensive axis. And what I mean by that is not simply the aggression you're going for, but it's how well are you able to utilize big hands. And generally, I would call a deck more aggressive if it's very good at utilizing big hands efficiently on offense, even to the point where they might, sort of scale with the cards that you have. But just in general, if you get a 5-card hand you are usually pretty good at utilizing, then you can be considered at least capable of aggression. Quite often, the more defensive decks tend to be the ones who are unable to efficiently utilize those big hands on offense. So they must be blocking with some of their cards in order to get full value, in order to get that sort of, let's say, 13 points of value that you're going for on an on-rate 4-card hand. Because if you're left with a 5-card hand with, for example, some of the Guardian heroes in this set, it is very, very likely that you will not be able to spend all those 5. And you will be basically giving yourself an intellect penalty at that point. So that's a very useful aspect to think about when building your deck, but also when facing one of these heroes, is that when you're facing a Victor or you're, to a lesser degree facing a Betsy, it can be fine giving them a 5-card hand because you might just rob value from their hand doing that. Cool, that's the x-axis here, and then the y-axis is how do you win or how do you close out the game. And some decks win with value. Those are down here. That means you're trying to just outgrind your opponent either throughout a very long game, which Victor is trying to do, or you're trying to do it pretty quickly. So you're not presenting any sort of evasion, but you're just pushing efficient damage turn to turn to turn to the point where it's much more inefficient for them to block because they probably have, 2 or maybe even 3 blocks in their hand, and that's how you're sort of grinding them out by outvaluing them because you're starting pretty soon to force them to blocking your big turns, whether they're just 9 damage or 10 damage or they go all the way up to like 15 or 16. It starts to weigh down when they have so many block 2s. And then at the top we have heroes which are trying to win with evasion. So what this means is that you're maybe not getting even on rate value for your cards necessarily, but you always have the threat of closing out the game from some life total, which could be sort of 3 for some heroes, or it could be 6 even for Betsy or Reinar, by presenting unblockable damage. And this can come in many forms. So there's attack reactions for the warriors. There's Intimidate for Rhinar, and to a lesser degree, much lesser degree for KO. And then there's Overpower for Betsy from her ability. So if you look at these axes, where do the heroes land? We have the warriors to the top left corner, meaning that they are very good at utilizing big hands, and they tend to close out the game with evasion rather than value grind as such. And what does this mean? It means that most of the warrior cards are 1-for-3s, the red ones. You pay 1, you pump your next warrior attack with 3, or then you kind of pump your warrior attack for 3 as an attack reaction. It's one of those two quite often. So basically the hands scale pretty well, especially up to 3 resources if you have a blue. But then you also might have some blues or yellows mixed in the rest of the hand. So it's very rare that you wouldn't be able to use your full 5-card hand even. It's not maybe for full value, but at least you can use all the cards in your hand. Generally, you win with evasion rather than value. Why is this? Because, as I said, you mostly have these 1-for-3s. And a 1-for-3 go again, or a 1-for-3 that doesn't spend your action point, it's fine, but it's nothing to write home about. Of course, they have some extra value in generating some of the tokens, where you can get to a 1-for-4 in some cases if they're blocking with an attack action or something like that. That starts to be on rate, but in general, you're a little bit below rate. And of course, your weapons save you a little bit, especially if you have agility tokens, because then you can spend 2 resources for 4 damage, which is quite efficient. But other than that, you're not exactly winning with value. You're winning by being able to, both on defense and on offense, use all of your cards quite efficiently. And then you can close the game from 3 life or 5 life or whatever you have in your hand in terms of attack reactions. And since the set doesn't have any defense reactions, it only has a few of these instants and the hat that blocks 2 damage as an instant, then those attack reactions are very efficient at closing up the game. Then you have the brutes, and the 2 brutes are a little bit different, where KO is definitely a value grind, turn-by-turn value grind, very aggressive deck. And when I say very aggressive, and then you see it's not all the way to the left, what does that mean? It means that if you don't have an agility token, you quite often struggle using all 4 or especially 5 cards in your hand as KO. So KO shifts very much in that x-axis depending on your agility token creation, which of course then tells you that probably you should be prioritizing agility tokens as KO. It has very little evasion other than sort of burst damage turns, which I consider value. Basically has pack hunt and a very rare usage of rawhide rumble, I would say. So it just wins by presenting a lot of damage every turn. Whereas Rhinar is more sort of smack in the middle. It can have a slightly tougher time using a full hand than KO, depending on the build, of course. Of course, you can build Rhinar kind of like KO. You can really prioritize the agility, and then it's kind of the same thing. But in general, if you have a little bit less agility, you focus more on getting the 6s, then Rhinar can have a tougher time being aggressive, but it can also have probably a little bit more 3-block since you're focusing on picking up the 3-block cards rather than the non-block cards that KO is picking. And it has also a lot more evasion in terms of intimidate, but setting up sort of big double intimidate turns is not super easy necessarily. So it kind of closes out the game with a combination of value grinding and that intimidate at the end. And then we have Guardians, where they're very different in nature. They have the same card pool almost, to the T, except for specializations, but they close out the game very differently. Both of them struggle a little bit with using big hands. Betsy is better at it because it has the ability where it can spend 2 resources for an overpower and +1 when it wagers. But Victor doesn't even have that. So how Victor spends a big hand is probably drawing cards off the gold if he wants to do that, if he's been generating some and trying to find some big threats that way. But otherwise struggles very hard with a 5-card hand. And also the way they win is a little bit different, where Betsy often or most often closes out the game with a big overpower attack. So you, for example, play a big bop or a bigger than big, and then on the next turn you come in for 12 overpower on a concuss or whatever for 3 cards, 12 overpower at that point, and you've been able to block with 1 or 2 cards. That's quite often the way a Betsy game ends, whereas a Victor game is always pretty much going to end with a value grind. The only evasion he has access to, I believe, is over the top, which is a rare. But other than that, he just tries to block very efficiently, prioritizes 3 and 4 blocks quite highly, and then hits you with these big attacks, the thunks, and so on, and tries to sort of grind deck value that way. Next, let's talk about some of the general notes and play patterns for Heavy Hitters Limited. First of all, the tokens that the various cards in the set generate: Agility, Might, Vigor, and Gold. One of the first things you'll notice when you start drafting this set is that they are not created equal. Agility tends to be by far the most valuable of these. It allows the brutes to go wide in the first place, and then it allows warriors to quite often craft their hand in a way where the agility token is an extra 2 value because they get to attack with another weapon. Often the warriors can sort of pile all their pumps into one attack, so they're not in a way dependent on 2 weapon attacks in terms of using their whole hand, but quite often they might have an extra resource floating around, which could be just a free 2 damage if they had the agility token. Also for Kasai, who wants to get free weapon attacks by drawing a card from a gold or something else, having the agility is very important, because then you can utilize that free attack twice and not just once. So agility tends to be the best. Might is kind of the reliable one. You always get 1 value. Very, very rarely there are turns where you will not attack at all, where you would lose the value from the Might, because most of your, or probably half of your cards block 2 or something like that. So that means that you're more often than not attacking at least once every turn, which means Might is always just +1 value. Of course, when you combine it with cards like Over the Top or Concuss or Command Respect, it can be more than 1 value. But generally it's the reliable one. And then Vigor has upside. Vigor is the upside one, where you quite often, and uncomfortably often, I would say, you completely lose the value of it because your hand just doesn't do anything with 4 resources if you have a blue pitch already. But in some cases, it can be worth 2 value. So for example, with Warrior, let's say you have an agility, but you already need to spend all of your resources to attack with your first sword and maybe pump it twice, something like that. Then the agility and the vigor give you another free weapon attack at that point. Also, it combines quite well with gold. So if we go to the gold token next, it's very, very hero dependent. Kasai, of course, uses it for her hero ability very efficiently. Victor draws a card off of it when he creates one from one of his own effects. So those are kind of special cases. Other than that, it tends to mostly be good if you have excess blues, or if you have the Betsy hat. Of course, if you have the Betsy hat, then gold is nuts, because it can sort of turn your goals into wagers, which enable you to use your ability and so on. But other than that, it's sort of good with excess blues, and it's good with vigor tokens. And why is it good with vigor tokens? And this sort of came up when I first played Olympia, where if you have, let's say, 2 goals sitting around on the board because you've won 2 wagers earlier on, then having some vigor tokens is actually pretty good, because you can very, very efficiently use the resources from them, by crafting your hand by cycling through some blues or some other cards with the gold. And of course, in general, you can just think of it as 2 vigors and a gold equals 1 card. So you can play a 6-card hand if you want, if you have 2 vigors and a gold. So it's a very good combo, and Olympia especially is good at utilizing that. Second, let's talk about evasion. So evasion differs by class in this set. Brutes have Intimidate, mostly Rhinar, but there's also Pack Hunt in common. Warriors have attack reactions, and there are no defense reactions. Do note that there are only some instants that prevent damage. So attack reactions are quite powerful at ending games. So be very, very wary of going down to like 3 life versus a warrior. You're almost dead, basically, at that point if you don't have Sheltered Cove or something like that. And then Overpower is the evasion of choice for Guardians, as well as in a couple of generics. So Down but not out, as well as Pay Up, at least have Overpower. For the Guardian cards, I think it's only Over the Top, which is a rare, but Betsy's hero ability, of course, gives Overpower as well. Finally, equipment. I want to talk about especially the hybrid equipment, which makes these tokens at the top. So we have Vigor Girth, Gauntlet of Might, and Flat Trackers. What you notice quite early on in the format is that especially Flat Trackers, to a lesser degree Gauntlet of Might, and maybe to a lesser degree Vigor Girth, they're used more often for their ability than their Blade Break one. And this was not the case in previous formats. In Outsiders, most of the Blade Break 1 equipment just blocked. And in some very rare cases, you use the ability, unless it was some really critical piece of equipment like the Ninja Mask. So why are these used for their ability? And also, why are they used so early for their ability? First of all, of course, as I said, agility is quite often like 2 value. It can be even more than that if you have a brute hand that just doesn't block well, but has 2 big attacks that you could utilize if you just had the agility token. So agility can be very, very valuable, much more than a Blade Break one. Might is generally just +1 value, so it doesn't matter if you attack with it or you block with it. But if you have these cards like Concuss or Command Respect or Over the Top, you can get more than 1 value out of it. Also, and the final note I want to make here is that if you have these class equipment, these Temper 2 class equipment like Raw Meat, Beckon Applause, and Stand Ground, the equipment generating hybrid equipment are super, super important at timing turns when you have both of those at the same time. So in this example, of course, you could have Gauntlet of Might and Flat Trackers. You start the game, and on turn 0, you pop both because you also have Raw Meat. So you can get a big turn on your first real turn, but you can also, avoid aggression from the other side by blocking with your Temper 2 equipment on that first turn. A very, very common play pattern. But so that's one way to use them. Another way to use them is if you've generated, let's say you're a warrior and you've generated vigor from something else, then maybe that's a good time to pop your Flat Trackers, because then you can block with your Beckon Applause and get also the agility and the vigor on the same turn, which then makes sure that you're not like drawing 4 reds and getting completely screwed or something like that when you have your agility turn. Let's go a little deeper into the generic equipment next. So there are 11 pieces of generic equipment that you can draft. They are all at common. We have 2 headpieces on the left. Then we have the adversity cycle here in the middle. And then we have this sort of UPF-themed lower life cycle on the right. So first of all, let's start with Glory Seeker. This is, in my mind, sort of a pack 1, pick 1 C-. It's kind of a fine piece of equipment that lets you cycle a card on turn 0, for example, or then it combines with these rising energy, rising power, rising whatever cards you have that sort of create a little bit of value by having drawn a card. But most of all, it's a Kasai card. So in Kasai, it's actually quite good. It's like a piece of gold that costs 3 and starts on the board. So you could say it's a silver that starts on your board. which is very, very good for your hero ability. Because here you draw a card, so you replace the blue that you pitched, and you get to swing with your weapons for free. So you're actually generating sort of 1 or 2 points of value from this hat. So for Kasai, it's fine. For everybody else, it's sort of a C-. Shelter Cove, again, I would say it's a C-. There's a lot of competition in the head slot. If you happen to be lucky enough to draw one of the rare hats for your hero, or you can pick Face Adversity, you can pick Headliner Helm, which are completely fine. So you shouldn't necessarily prioritize all these head equipment that much, even though they don't sort of clash with the hybrid equipment. But yeah, the Sheltered Cove, it's kind of a C-. The Guardians probably like it a bit more because they have sort of extra blues. So they could be utilizing that more efficiently than everybody else. And they're also a little bit more into these grindy games. And the Guardians really want to make sure that they don't like randomly lose to a piece of evasion, especially an attack reaction or an overpower, which this is good against. But pretty much for everybody, this is like a sideboard. I would say like a sideboard B- against Warrior. Because against Warrior, the end game is really, really rough. Where if both of you go low, if both of you go to like 3 life, then you will lose more often than not, simply because you cannot overblock all their attacks by 3. And they will have that 3-point attack reaction at some point, and you're just dead in the water. But if you have Sheltered Cove, it makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, where you can, their agility turn where they're coming in for two swords, they have 1 floating and 1 card in hand or arsenal or whatever. You can just, happily block them Xaxes, or you can take them depending on your life total, and always know that as long as you're not at sort of 1 life, you can always Sheltered Cove their attack reaction. I really like it as a sideboard card versus Warrior, but other than that, it's kind of trash. Next, we have the Adversity Cycle. So as pack 1, pick 1s, these are sort of C to C+. They're fine. They're usually sideboard cards in the sense that, there's probably 1 deck or one class that they don't really do much against. But when they do something, they are very good. They are Blade Break 2s. And even though you don't control when you get to use them, and you should use them whenever, the first opportunity that you get, they're still really good. 2 life is 2 life. That's fantastic. So looking at these, I would say Face Adversity is kind of a sideboard B- versus Olympia and KO. KO draws cards from Wild Rides and Bear Fangs, and Olympia draws cards from all the gold they generate. And it's probably a B+ versus Kasai, who really wants to be drawing cards from Draw Swords and gold and any effect they can get their hands on to turn on their free weapon attacks. So Face Adversity, really good card against those heroes. Overcome Adversity then, the legs one, which you can block with if they've broken an agility, or if they've destroyed an agility token this turn. It's probably like a B for Guardians, because it only competes with Stand Ground, which is a very unreliable piece of equipment. It's actually not that easy to be generating both a Vigor and a Might on the same turn with a Guardian, unless you happen to have those 2 pieces of hybrid equipment. But even then, it still blocks for 2, and this blocks for 2, so they're only equal. Only if you have 2 turns in the game where you have both a Vigor and a Might, then the Stand Ground is better than Overcome Adversity. Versus, of course, it's not versus everybody. So if you're versing a Guardian Mirror, then the Overcome Adversity doesn't really do absolutely anything. However, since you are one of the Guardians, and there are usually roughly 2 Guardians per pod, then probably 6 out of the 7 possible opponents the Overcome Adversity is really good against. So if you're a Guardian, you probably want to be picking Overcome Adversity pretty high. The others are sort of a C to C+, and you bring them in against the right matchups. A fun trick with these pieces is that, let's say you have an Overcome Adversity and you're facing a Guardian. Well, now you can wage agility quite freely, because if they block it out and they win the wager, then you have a block 2 in your hands. So your wager cards for that particular token become kind of like freebies. You kind of win either way. So something cool to keep in mind. Finally, we have the lower life cycle. These pack one, pick one to me are like D plus to C minus. You don't really want to be picking these early. You kind of want to be picking these in like very late in the packs, or then sort of pack 2, especially pack 3 a little later when you are missing a piece completely and you want to fill your equipment. That's where these come in, and they're fine. They're like really bad iron rods, which in most games you do get to use, but you definitely don't get to pick when you use them. You just use them right away when you can, because you might never get another chance. Bloodied Oval, the shield, it's a little bit different because it's basically a Guardian card. You don't really want to be playing it in anything else. And the rare shield is kind of hard to find, so it's kind of a C plus in Guardians because it's not really competing with much. But it's truly an F in all the other classes. Next, let's talk about the rares and commons that you will be drafting. And I will also talk about generics towards the end. But let's start with the rares and with down but not out. So this card is an absolute bomb. What makes it even more of a bomb is that it goes into every deck. So it's a 3 for 5, and when it's turned on, which, do note, requires all 3 conditions to be met. So you need to have less life, control fewer equipment, and control fewer tokens than your opponent. But when that happens, it's a 3 for 8 with overpower and an agility, might, and vigor token on hit. So not even a wager, so it's only for you, which is, I guess, rare in this format. But this is sort of format defining in a way, and many sealed games were ended by this, or the tide was turned by this, and many draft games as well. It's very flavorfully fitting for the format that there's this off chance that your opponent has this one card where they can dig themselves out of a pretty bad situation. But overall, this is really, really strong. It's like an A minus, maybe even an A. For KO, it's the best in red because it's also a 6 attack for them. And for others, it's kind of a B minus to B plus to A minus, something maybe more towards the B to B plus range, I would say. Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind with this card is that since you need all 3 conditions met, you can insulate yourself against this card by blocking with all of your equipment. But that's not often easy to do, so it requires a bit of work, and it requires sort of remembering that this card exists, because it's only the rare cases when you get to see it from a clash or something beforehand. So there are situations when you just want to block your stand ground for 0 if you've already gotten the 2 block out of it, for example, just to not be hit by this. If you have this in your deck, there are situations when you should not be playing one of your equipment. So, for example, you should, there are situations when you can leave the face adversity, or let's say confront adversity, on your sideboard if you don't expect them to be turned on in that particular matchup. Also, extremely strong in blue, one of the best blues in the set. Next, we have Wage Gold. Another really strong pack one, pick one, because it's a 3 for 7. And unlike the previous one, this is universal, which means that it is always your class. So all the warrior pumps, and all the attack reactions, all of those work with this one. It has that going for it, but of course it's a block 2 and the ability is much, much weaker. So in that sense, it's not on the same level. Victor is probably where this is best. Although in Victor, probably half the time you are drawing a blue, which you don't really want to arsenal. So it's not, crazy strong to win the wager, but it's still pretty strong. And for others, it's kind of a C plus to B minus. You always want to put it in your deck. You're never unhappy with this card, but it's just for some other classes, it doesn't necessarily do as much. Olympia kind of likes this as well because it's a wager card, but of course, Olympia can already generate a lot of gold, so maybe it wants to wager other things. Next, we have Reinforce the Line. You look at this and you think of it as a 0-for-4 defense reaction. You're like, oh my god, this is an A. But that's definitely not the case. I actually rate this pretty low, and probably lower than a lot of other people. I rate this as kind of a C. Pack one, pick one, C. Betsy, Victor, and Reinar, who are the heroes that most want to be blocking with attack actions, it's more like a C+. For the others, it's kind of a D- to a C. KO wants to fill their deck with 5s. So this is another non-blue, non-5 attack, which is putting in, so it's not that great. And the Warriors, of course, cannot even use this because most of their cards are not attack actions. This, of course, gets better versus evasion decks. So this gets much better against Warriors, even in yellow. Even the yellow one is decent against Warriors because they're usually pumping for 3 and the yellow one blocks for 3 extra. So having that in Arsenal, again, makes you feel kind of warm and fuzzy. But also you can use this against Betsy if they're trying to finish the game with a big overpower attack. So it's kind of a sideboard B- or B or something like that against those decks. Next we have Adrenaline Rush. This was a decent, fine card in Monarch, especially in Bolton. But it's a pretty bad card in this set. And why is that? Well, first of all, it's getting to lower life total. Something you can quite easily do by not blocking. But what's the payoff? You're getting an unreliable 2-for-7 that blocks for 2. So what are you going to do with the other 1 resource that you have from your blue? Because the set is full of 3-for-7s. So how is a conditional 2-for-7? How are you going to be better than a 3-for-7? Well, it's not very easy because all of your pumps, they miss this card. Not only the warrior pumps, but also the lead with speeds, lead with powers, and so on. They don't hit these cards because they are hybrid cards that hit those 2 classes. So it's quite difficult actually to use the extra resource. So basically the one situation, or maybe like the 2 situations where this card is good, is with warrior when you have an agility token and you have less life. You can come in for 2-card 9, which is of course fantastic, but that's a super rare occurrence to happen because those conditions are not like trivial to meet. The other one is with brute. If you have an agility token and you have like a very specific set of other cards like an agile wind-up or a mighty wind-up or something like that, where you can give your claw go again, and then you can come in for another 2. But that's like even more rare. That's a crazy rare situation. So more often than not, this is like a card that you're stuck in your hand with when you have more life than them, or you get to manufacture a situation where you're at less life, but that means you had to block less than you wanted to. And suddenly you don't only have Adrenaline Rush in your hand, you have other cards in your hand that are not maybe synergizing with it at all. So I would pick this pretty low. It's kind of a C- in all heroes in my mind. Next we have Performance Bonus. This is a little better. This is more like a pack one, pick one, C+. And this is one of the payoff cards for Victor, because Victor draws a card when they hit with this. And what's even better is this has go again when it's coming from Arsenal, which means that the card you draw doesn't have to be the card that goes into your arsenal. So if you have a red in hand, for example, and you come in with this and this hits, you can then decide what you do with the card that you drew. Of course, maybe that's not the perfect hand to be playing this with. Maybe you want like a slightly bigger hand with more flexibility. But anyway, Wage Gold has the problem where you have to arsenal the card to get value from it if you hit with it. Whereas with this one, you have a lot more flexibility once it hits. With Kasai, this is maybe like a C+ because you really like the gold later on for your ability. For everybody else, this is like a D+ to a C. It's not great, but it can help you go wide. And if you can use the gold somehow, then fantastic. Rally the Rear Guard makes a comeback. I think it's a C+, kind of as a pack one, pick one. It's a little better in Brute because it's a 6. Even the yellow one in KO is fine because it's a 6 for KO. It helps you block with your non-blocks if that's what you want to be doing. Although quite often, those at least KO really wants to be attacking with their non-blocks because they're their best cards that they have. But it's fine. It kind of helps you block for 2.5 each with 2 cards. It attacks for 6 on 2 resources, which is fine. But again, it misses all the pumps and all of that, so it's not a very flexible offensive card. But it's fine. Trade-in. This is another sort of C+, pack 1, pick 1. It's fine. This is kind of like performance bonus. It's very different by hero. So Rhinar and Kassa, I really like this. Rhinar because they like choosing what they discard. Turns on 2 claws and gets an intimidate trigger if they discard a 6. And Kassa, of course, gets free weapon attacks from the card draw. For everybody else, this is kind of like a D+ to a C. It's fine to play this in KO because you get your might token and it's not random, etc., etc. But really, you want to be filling your KO deck with 5 attacks and blues, and even your blues would rather be 5 attacks. So you don't want too many of these misses in your deck because you really want to be winning the game with Wild Rides and Bear Fangs. Next, we have Lunging Press making a comeback. This is almost like the quintessential C- card. It's fine. You play it because it's a blue and it blocks 2, and it has an ability which can sometimes be useful, but it's nothing flashy. Like, even if you do the thing where you attack with a concuss, they block for Exacxes, and then or maybe they don't even block because it's not online yet, and then you play Lunging Press and you feel like you got him. Even then, you spent the card to get 1 damage and a card, and the card they can choose what it is. So you're not really tremendously above rate even in the best case scenario. So this is kind of like a C- or maybe a C for Betsy. Money Where Your Mouth Is. It's a fine card. It hits all the attacks. So this is unlike any other pump. This sort of works with your Rally the Rear Guards or Adrenaline Rushes and so on. It also creates a gold, which many heroes don't utilize super well. And it has the risk of giving your opponent a gold, which, again, if they have the hero that can use it better, it's quite risky. But it's fine. For Betsy, it's kind of the only, or one of the only pumps that they can get, which are not like pumping the next turn's attack, but this turn's attack. So it's and it wagers, which is fine. It wagers for Olympia, which I guess is a bit of a bonus, but it's not. You can do better than this. And of course, Kassai wants the gold. That's fine. Victor, even though it draws a card from the gold, it probably wants to be playing something different than a 1 for 3 that blocks 2. Next, we have Starting Stake. This only comes in yellow. It's a block 3, which is what it's mostly like 95% of the time it's used for the block 3. Of course, if you draw this in your opening hand and it's turn 0, that's great. You get a gold. So for Kasai, it's I bumped it up a little bit to a C for 2 reasons. One is that it's a yellow that goes to your graveyard quite easily by blocking 3. So you want some yellows in your graveyard, and if you draw this on your turn 0, you get the gold. That's fantastic. You get it's basically 2 free value that you got there. And Victor, you draw a card off of it. That's not really what you want to be using it for, though. What you want to be using it for is being a non-attack that blocks for 3, which can be very important against warriors. So if you're trying to grind out games as Victor, that's mostly why you would pick this card. Everybody else is like a D+ to C-. Then we have Test of Strength as the final generic common in the set. This is a pretty strong pack 1 pick 1, and that's not because it like happily goes into every deck. That's not the case. You probably don't want, like, more often than not, you don't want this in your warrior decks if you can avoid it. Of course, it's a 0 for 4 block, which is fine, but in a warrior deck, you're mostly losing the clash. So it's a 0 for 4 that gives your opponent a gold. And depending on your opponent, they might be very good at using the gold. So you really don't want to be giving it to a Kasai, for example. And the Guardians as well, they can kind of use it with their Vigor tokens and their huge amount of blues to smooth out their bad hands. So it's quite a risky card to play, but it is still a very high pick for me early on because it's such a strong card for Victor. For Victor, this is an absolute A. If you win the Clash, which of course in Constructed you probably do more than in Limited, but even in Limited, if you crafted your deck to be, have very few misses in it, let's say you more often than not, you win the Clash, you create a gold, you draw a card, and this is on your opponent's turn, so you can still have a lot of optionality on what you do with that extra card drawn. And by the way, the gold that you just created probably helps you smooth out the hand if you drew something that you couldn't use otherwise. So insane value from one card for Victor. So this is basically the reason to go Victor is if you have a couple of these, maybe a performance bonus or two. For everybody else, this is like a D to C plus, like probably something like Rhinar and KO. They kind of like this. They would rather have 6s in their deck, but at least it blocks for 4, and they quite often win the Clash. So that's it. That's the generic commons and rares. The standout cards here, if you look at this chart, is Test of Strength is an A for Victor. Down but not out is kind of a B plus for everybody almost, and maybe an A minus for KO. Just a fantastic card. Wage Gold is a pretty good pack one pick one card as well to pick up because it goes into absolutely everything as a 3 for 7 with an ability on top. Finally, if we look at the Majestics, the generic Majestics, there are 6 of those in the set. And starting from the left here, we have Nasty Surprise. It's a 0 for 2, block 3, blue. When an opponent's effect puts this into your graveyard from anywhere, create an Agility, Might, and Vigor token. So this is basically if you get concussed, or you for some reason put this in your arsenal, you're getting command respected. But that's a weird case. So much more likely that you're facing a concuss and you discard this. You get the value of the card you lost back. Of course, super, super good in that scenario. So it's absolutely the best versus Guardian. But there are very few Guardians floating around. There's usually maybe 2-ish per pod. Even fewer concusses, of course, floating around because they don't play those every turn. So that's a very niche case. So it's mostly just a generic blue block 3, which is kind of a C. It's fine, but it's an attack, so it's not it's not even a great block 3 versus warriors. So next we have Pay Up. Pay Up is a 3 for 6 block 3 red. If defending hero controls a gold, this gets overpower. And when this hits a hero, gain control of a gold token they control. If you don't deal 1 damage to them. So against gold, this is a 3 for 6 overpower that takes the gold. And if they don't have gold, this is a 3 for 6 that pings them for 1 if they take it. So it's a 3 for 6 or 7. And it's a block 3. So it's extremely versatile. It's very, very good. It's you play it in every deck happily. Incidentally, your opponent might have gold, and it becomes a nice finisher. The Brutes really like it as a 6 as well. And the upside when they have gold is actually, quite good, especially if it's someone like Kasai who would have really benefited from that gold. So it's a great card. It's like a B minus, super versatile to be picking early. Next we have Ripple Away. It's a blue block 3, 4 attack for 2 resources, where as an instant you can discard it from your hand, and it says if an action card would create 1 or more tokens this turn, instead it creates that many -1 of each of those tokens. I have never seen this used yet. It would have to be a very specific scenario. Maybe against like a down but not out, you could, if you have an additional blue, you could use this and then they don't get 3 tokens. That's pretty good value. But Other than that, it's a blue block 3 attack. So it's kind of like Nasty Surprise, but a tiny bit better because the using the ability might come up a little bit more often. Preventing a KO from having an agility might actually be quite valuable. It kind of has another mode which can get 3-ish value. And it also wins clashes a little bit more often than Nasty Surprise would. So it's kind of like a C+. Next we have Standing Order. It's the only 0 for 4 in the set. So it's a 0 for 4, blocks 3. When this attacks or defends, you may put a card from your arsenal on the bottom of your deck. If you do this, gets +2 attack and +2 defense. Super, super versatile card. I think it's like a B+. It's one of the best things you want to be first picking in this set. You get 4 value just by having an action point at the end of your turn. It blocks for 3. It can help you block for 5 if you've had to put a bad card into your arsenal. It can help you attack for 6 if you've put a bad card in your arsenal. So it just does everything other than pitching. So it's just a fantastically versatile card, and you should pick it. Next, we have Tenacity. It's a yellow 0 for 2, blocks for 3. When this attacks, it gets +X attack, where X is the number of defending cards on the combat chain. This could be kind of a neat trick with Warrior, where you're waging and you have an agility token. So you're putting all your pumps into your first attack, you're wagering it. Maybe they win the wager because they block with 3 cards, and then you play Tenacity for 5. That's neat, but very specific scenario. It's mostly like a block 3 attack, which is not great in this set. You would much rather have a block 3 non-attack. So if that's the only use case for it. Pitches for yellow, not great. The 0 for 2, 0 for 3, or 0 for 4, something like that when you have an agility token. So finally, we have Seduce Secrets. 0 cost instant, which says look at target hero's hand and the top card of their deck. If this was played from Arsenal, draw a card. This is an F. It is so close to a cracked bubble. And it almost is a cracked bubble, except if you get to put it in your arsenal, and then it kind of recovers its value back and has a little bit of extra informational value against warriors, maybe. So you could, in theory, call this like a D- against warriors. Like a sideboard D-. But it's a bad card. Don't pick it. It doesn't block. Pitches for 2. It doesn't do anything. That's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, but most of all, comment with your feedback. This is the first time I'm doing something like this. So please leave your comments, whether positive, negative, anything in between. Happy to hear your feedback, either in the comments here or on Twitter @BrambleSpark. And of course, you can find ArsenalPass on @ArsenalPass. Thank you again. I will see you in the next episode.